Hi everyone, my name is Jessie Motes. I'm a solutions engineer at GitHub, which means I help take our enterprise customers from getting started with GitHub all the way to their ongoing relationship using GitHub at work. And I'm here today to talk to you about Codespaces. Codespaces is a newer GitHub product which allows you to host fully fledged development environments in the cloud with the help of GitHub, being able to launch them directly out of your repositories that you work on, and giving your developers a very quick and seamless way to access their development environments without a lot of extra work. So let's talk a little bit about why GitHub decided to develop Codespaces. So what GitHub Codespaces are, like I said, are a cloud-hosted developer environment, fully fledged. Everything that you would have on a local machine, you can have on these developer environments. You can have as big as 32 cores and 64 gigabytes of RAM, full compute backing, all of the dependencies, extensions, all the way down to your settings for your IDE. You can set up ahead of time, meaning that you can launch all of that in a click of the button from the code, no matter what machine you're working on. You could be working from a very underpowered, laptop or even a tablet with web access and be able to use a code space and launch it and have that full power of your pre-configured development environment backing it from one click within your GitHub repository. So this helps improve a few things. Obviously, the mean time to onboard anybody just getting started with a code base, whether it's somebody, again, work sharing, coming into a project to help out, whatever it is, or if you've got lots of new folks onboarding, you've got contractors or external collaborators that need to be able to access your code and are just getting started with it. It's a faster bootstrap with a cloud native experience. You don't have to worry about them having the right powered machine with the right things installed on it. You can completely standardize your environment so you don't have all of the, hey, it works on my machine scenario. Standardize the environment, get all of those development requirements in place in a single file, configuration file, which I'll show momentarily, and everybody has the same experience. So you don't have any disparities between, hey, it works on my machine, but it doesn't. And then thirdly, for those of us who are using this at work, of course, we want to be able to have visibility, traceability over who's doing what and how much compute they're using and all of those things. There's a lot more auditing capabilities and policies that you're able to use to be able to set up these code spaces. And really, honestly, we're projecting this to be a way to really help keep development secure because you have a single setup that everyone's using. It's not local machines floating around everywhere. We're all using a code space. And we just use our terminals, our local clients, to be able to access that code space that is not local to my machine. So even if things were compromised in some way, we'd have a way to secure that. So one of the most interesting use cases, of course, we've got lots of customers that are using code spaces so far, but GitHub ourselves have made great use of code spaces. GitHub is one of the largest Ruby monoliths out there today, the actual GitHub service itself. And so we've made great use of actually taking this and applying it at the GitHub company with our own developers. As you can see, we had a very, very large 82 gig repository that developers could take days when they were getting started to bootstrap. And now it takes less than 10 seconds. Even with a fully set up machine, it could take up to 45 minutes before Codespaces. And we've got over 600 engineers using this successfully every day. All of our engineers every day use Codespaces to be able to develop in a more performant way. So I'm going to take a break here from the slides and show you what Codespaces looks like. All right, so now we're looking at a demo repository with a simple Java app in it. And we can see a few things just getting started with this repository. We've got this special configuration directory called dev container. And what this has in it are a couple of files that help set up our code space when we launch it. One of them, the kind of core, is going to be our dev container.json file here. And this has a number of different components in it. You can tell for your build to use a Docker file if you'd like to use a Docker file. And that's referenced in the same dev container directory that we saw our dev container.json living in. So you can reference that here and say, this is what we're going to use for our build. And then Docker will be implemented as part of your development environment. You can set up your ports for when you actually build the debug version of your application. We'll see that in just a moment once I launch the code space. You can identify which extensions you'd like pre-configured on your IDE. We're using VS Code here today. There are some additional IDE supports coming down the line here, but this indicates all of the VS Code extensions that we'd like to have pre-installed and pre-configured, as well as some settings for our IDE here. There's also some personal VS Code settings that I can show in just a moment that are also set up. And then, of course, we have all of our dependencies that we want imported as part of our build process that we have for our application. So you can see things like Java and Maven, enabling telemetry, etc. And then the last item here is our standard requirements, the base requirements for our actual code space, compute space. So you can give a minimum there to make sure that your code space is at least at minimum resourced at a certain level to make sure that it has enough capacity to run whatever it is that you need to run. If we come back up here, you'll see again our Docker file that lives in the same place so that we can make sure that we have our Docker file ready to go. And as I mentioned, we do also have the opportunity to set some VS Code settings. Those would live in here. Now, when we want to launch our code space, all we need to do is go to this code dropdown. This is where you'd usually go if you wanted to clone a local copy of the repository or download a zip. But now we have an extra section in here called Codespaces. And you can see here, I've actually got an idle version of my code space that's already built so that this will launch a little bit faster. We'll talk about some options for speeding up the launch and build of Codespaces in just a moment. But you can also always create a new one, either just with the default options that we set in our dev container that we just showed, or you can actually drop down here if you wanted to configure and create your code space with different settings before you launched it. But let's go ahead and launch our existing one just to show how quick this is. And again, this has been sitting idle for just a few minutes, but it's already been built. So it should build out pretty fast here using those dev container settings that we had. Great. And we can see here now, we've got a full VS Code launch that's coming in with all of our extensions like we specified. We've got Docker in there. And so we're just going to give this a second to get all initialized like we need. And then we're going to hop over and actually start to launch this in debug, just so I can show how this will run. So this actually runs now local to this code space version of my app as it currently stands. We come over here to the port section. We can actually launch this in browser and see the local version of this. And you could share this with anybody you are working with. So if you wanted to work off the same version of the application, you can share the actual URL here. You also have the ability, of course, to use the live share functionality like in VS Code. That's installed here as well. The reason I wanted to show that is because I'm now going to add in a little bit of a change to my application. So I'm going to take some shortcuts just because I'm in a demo mode here and I don't want to make you watch me type code. What I'll do is just run a command here to add our feature in. So we're going to add a little rating addition to what was basically a bookstore of different books that we recommend. Add in a feature here. So I'm going to go ahead and run task and add a rating. To our bookstore. And great, that did run successfully. Awesome. So now we can see if we come over to our source control area, we've got some changes that were added. Let's go ahead and stage all of those. Say add rating, commit them, publish our branch. Let's not create a pull request. You guys know how to do that already, I'm sure. And then if we come back over into our application, now this should allow us to actually see our application with the new settings. Great, so we can see our rating added into the local version of our code. So it gives you a really quick and easy way to, again, just like you would on a local setup, launch the application, see it running, see it built, everything that you could do on a local, but done all in the cloud on GitHub hosted virtual machines that are set up the same way every time when you launch them. That's the core and the beauty of Codespaces. And of course, if we wanted to head back over to GitHub to take care of that pull request, we could do that. Here it already tells us there's a new branch, it's got changes, go ahead and do your pull request, just like you could actually within the VS Code environment as well. So let's take just a second here to take a look at some of our settings that we have available for Codespaces. So if you jump into the repo settings, we've got a section for Codespaces here. And you can set up what are called pre-builds. Pre-builds are a way of speeding up that Codespaces build so that you don't have to have one sitting idle all the time. You can have a quick start. Like I mentioned with that less than 10-second bootstrap that we have for the GitHub monolith today, this is how we do it. We use these pre-builds to take a branch. So we could take main, for example, and use that as our baseline and use our configuration file, our dev container that we have. And then you can choose how often you actually want that pre-build to run. Of course, the more often you do it, the more overhead there's going to be, but the more up to date it can be. So you can do default to every push, every time main changes, you want the pre-build to rerun so that you always have the latest. You can also have it only run if there's a change on dev container, if this is maybe a little bit more of a stale branch, something that doesn't have things happening quite as often, this might be an option. You can also pre-build on a schedule, choose a cadence that you want it to run on instead of triggering off of pushes or configuration changes. You can choose regional availability. You can retain a certain number of versions, and of course, you can let people know if there are fails in the pre-build. So this is a great way to make sure that you have an up-to-date pre-build that will make things launch faster, especially if you're dealing with large code bases. So this is available right now in beta, and we hope to go GA with this later this year. So you saw everything you've seen so far was running on VS Code, which is what we started with as kind of our initial target for an IDE for Codespaces. And we are adding in support for JetBrains. There's currently a private alpha going on for this, and we hope to expand it out further soon. So if JetBrains is your IDE of choice, we're happy that we'll soon be able to support this, especially if you're using any of the options under JetBrains like IntelliJ, PyCharm, RubyMine, WebStorm, etc. So look forward to that coming soon. We also talked a little bit about pre-builds and other project types. So being able to better handle things like multi-repo context where you have multiple repos. We saw that right now Codespace is a little bit centered on just a single repo, but if you have something like microservices where you might need to pull from multiple repos to do a project build, we're building out better support for that as well as for mono repos. Definitely pre-build support helps with that and being able to target what exactly you need out of the mono repo. Codespaces pre-builds, like we talked about, is currently in beta, and this allows you to create those pre-built kind of backings for your Codespaces so that they build faster and launch faster when folks need to access them. And the policies that I just showed are coming soon here as well. The auto delete and data retention are available now, as are the allowed machine types, port visibility, and maximum idle timeouts. And then as you saw, we're working on things like a dev container allow list, allowed regions, and even forcing to clone only to Codespaces. Again, thinking about that security-minded option of, do we want to allow folks to do anything locally, or should everything happen out on Codespaces? Private networking is also something we're looking at. We know that everybody does their deployments and their dependencies and everything a little bit differently, and a lot of folks do need access into on-prem resources in order to use Codespaces. So we are looking at building out different ways of allowing for secured private networking, whether it's through a private VPN gateway that's injected in, as well as Azure VNet integration. Especially if you're using Azure, this is going to be a very helpful thing to be able to have that private secured networking available for the Codespace to actually use. It knows about the VNet and is able to use it. Again, this is coming soon. Beta is available for the private VPN gateway. Azure VNet is in an alpha, and talk to your account team if those are things that you're interested in using. Great. So thanks for taking the time with me to talk a little bit about Codespaces today. I hope you enjoyed and learned something, and happy to take more questions either asynchronously or through your GitHub team members that you're connected with. We'd all love to talk more about Codespaces.